Bindige mushimis, bindige nikumus, bindige gichimanitu, windigo kan bindi bindige, windigo kan bindi bindiga. Good evening, everyone. My name is Leslie Sabiston. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to welcome you all to the second biannual Richard F. Salisbury Memorial Lecture. Thank you all for being here. I come from a place called Selkirk, Manitoba, which is located on the Red River, the heart of the Métis Nation, for which I am a citizen. It is also Treaty 1 territory and the home of the Anishinaabe and Cree First Nations, to which I share many kinship ties. As is custom, I think, for most of us, at least in Canada these days, and particularly universities, even NHL hockey games, we start off events by giving land acknowledgements to pay homage to the Indigenous nations whose stewardship on these lands precedes the historical emergence of the Canadian state, and exceeds the political and legal mechanisms and imaginaries by which the state asserts its sovereignty. The land we stand on today has been a meeting ground for various nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe peoples. It has been known as Tiohtià:ke, which I have learned recently means broken in two. I still don't know the whole story of the meaning of that name, but it seems like an important breakup story, and one that I want to learn more about. Montreal has also been known as Muniang in the Anishinaabe-Moan language, and I'll have to wait on further clarification on that one, because it might potentially have some unsavory meanings to it, and I suspect it might be related to the breakup story as well. But in all seriousness, my original remarks that I had prepared for this evening, I had about 10 minutes of discussion of land acknowledgements as a complicated topic, partly because I think I have Mushimus energy, which is grandpa energy, and I can talk on and on and on, and people tend to fall asleep, and that's just how it goes. But also it's a very serious topic, and one that I care a lot about. Sometimes I wonder if these land acknowledgements are serving as some kind of protective strategy of both acknowledging this complicated past while also paradoxically looking away. As a descendant of peoples who have had their lands stolen by sophisticated legal maneuvers as well as brutal force, it is easy to become cynical about these land acknowledgements and to begin to wonder what these rituals are actually accomplishing and who the beneficiaries are of such gestures. Taking the lead of some of my American students, however, just this week, who appreciate these acknowledgements precisely because they have nothing like that where they come from, just a few hours over the border in New York State, for instance. Today I want to celebrate the moves that McGill has made recently towards reckoning with its past. I think we can see this effort in seminal reports such as the Provost Task Force on Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Education in 2017. I am quite literally indebted to this report in many ways, but as a historical document, the report also serves as a marker or a reminder, perhaps, of the ongoing work that still needs to be done. And so it informs our aspirations and our horizons of moving forward with care as we continue to reckon with the realities like, what does it mean to live on unceded land? I believe such reports point towards a growing humility and courage to wonder how places like McGill and Montreal came to be, how names like Tiohtià:ke fell from our memories. Telling stories is very much part of our discipline as anthropologists, and as I just taught my students on Wednesday, Native Studies too. And Native Studies is largely about writing names in both spellings and scriptive and moralistic meanings of that word or words. I'm glad to be here with you all tonight, with Dr. Paige West especially, because she is someone who honors and remembers names, and she has a keen ear for listening to the stories that they tell. Before we can get to Paige, Dr. Paige West. However, there are a few more ceremonial movements we have to make together. And I really want to take seriously that this is a ceremonial event that we are in, a memorial event. And so Grandpa Energy is on full display tonight, despite the very wise advice from some of my colleagues to keep it short. I apologize in advance. So first, I want to ground us in remembering, like I just said, that we are here tonight to honor another name, Richard F. Salisbury. Richard Salisbury was a man of great conviction, someone who stubbornly believed in the capacity of communicating across difference, and someone who thought deeply about his own conditions, how his own conditions affected others. As we remember Richard, I also want us to thank his children, Catherine, Tom, and John is with us tonight. Sadly, Catherine and Tom could not be here for personal family reasons, and so we will keep them in our hearts tonight. And hopefully they are live streaming in, so hello. And also Richard's wife, Mary. This family, made a very generous donation to McGill and has enabled us to keep this very purposeful intellectual energy alive at the university. By all accounts, I have learned that Richard was a nurturing scholar, one of those professors who always was building up his students and colleagues and creating conditions for growth. And so I thank the Salisbury family, who also clearly carry these noble qualities, for giving us all the opportunity tonight and for many other nights to come, in which we can nurture one another with good thinking and conversation. A quick word on proceedings. I will be turning the floor over eventually to Interim Dean David Wright, Dean of Arts, who will share some words about the Richard Salisbury's history at McGill and the emergence of the memorial lecture. Then we will hear some brief comments from Professor of Anthropology John Galati, who had the good fortune of knowing Richard and who will give us a more personalized address of who Richard was within the university and in the discipline of anthropology. Finally, I will provide some short-ish introductory comments about Paige, Dr. Paige West, before turning the floor over to her. And I believe we will have enough time tonight for a short Q&A. And for those of us who are able, we will then continue our conversation under more personal circumstances in the reception, which is to take upstairs in the gallery. So I hope you all can join us for some hors d'oeuvres and some wine. Finally, a few thank yous and regrets. Interim Principal Christopher Manfredi sends his condolences for not being able to be here tonight, particularly because this event is participating in some of the central strategies by which McGill is currently trying to reorganize its commitments to the world, including climate change and Indigenous reconciliation. I would like to thank the Faculty of Arts, and particularly Interim Dean David Wright, for their support in making this evening possible, including very generous financial support. Thank you to the Center for Indigenous Conservation and Development Alternatives for its continued financial generosity in making this event possible, and a special shout out to Professor Colin Scott for his ongoing leadership in this center. I would also like to thank our current chair, Lisa Stevenson, for her outstanding leadership in our department and her unwavering commitments to making this department a rich intellectual community. I would also like to send a special thank you to former chair of the Department of Anthropology and former chair of the Salisbury Committee, Setrak Manukian. Thank you for responding to my many emails, for always making yourself available to me and other junior colleagues. I deeply appreciate both of your collegiality and your deep commitments to mentorship. Thank you to Sarah Lucasen, from the development officer in the Faculty of Arts and part of the University Advancement Team. She was instrumental in coordinating with the Salisbury family to get this memorial lecture off the ground. Thank you also to her colleague, Alicia Anderson, another development officer. And also Sarah was instrumental in establishing not only the memorial lecture, but also creating the Richard F. Salisbury Undergraduate Prize in Anthropology, which is very helpful for our students every year. Thank you also to our critical media lab, in particular Philippe Leonard, the man behind the camera here, who helps us at all of our events and makes sure that the tech is all in order, and with a particular artistic flair to it as well. We really appreciate your energies. Thank you to our fabulous unofficial artist in residence. Oh no. Elijah Cardinal Whitford, who designed this beautiful poster that I'm sure you all have seen. Thank you, Elijah, for your keen eye towards detail. Paige noticed the mud crab that you featured on this poster, and it resonated in her heart. And I hope she'll have the opportunity to tell you that. Thank you to our amazing administrative team who's been working behind the scenes for so many months on making this event possible. Thank you to Rosa Rodriguez, Joseph Hakim, Andy Catalano, and Fatina Fassi Al-Zaman. Thank you to our students, Caroline Siegel, Tuya Montgomery, and Riley Bertoncini, for being gracious guides for Paige while she's here. And last but certainly not least, thank you to the Red Path Museum for its hospitality, and particularly to Jeanette Desaro for your help in making this event possible. Also thank you to John Galati for agreeing to share some words with us today. So now I will turn the floor over to Interim Dean David Wright. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Les, for that. And for those, I found quite moving comments about land acknowledgements and reflection. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a historian. I'm a historian of medicine, so it's very unusual to be here. I feel like I'm going to be laid out and dissected if I say the wrong thing. But I'm also a Canadian historian. I rotate through post-Confederation Canadian history. I was born here on this unceded land just up the hill. And it's been an interesting journey for those of us who are not Indigenous who teach Canadian history to take on board what's happened in the last 10 years, the sort of the culture change, the sort of self-criticism that is needed to teach our classes in Canadian history in a more thoughtful manner. And that's an ongoing process, and I don't pretend to have gotten it right. I just want to acknowledge it's been a very sort of fascinating, critical journey that I think will continue as we try to really think about how we teach the next generation Canadian history, what we include, what we exclude, how we frame it, how we understand it. And so I really appreciated your comments about that, both individually, but also as a historian. It's been an absolutely unusual week for me. This is my second last week as interim dean of arts. And earlier this week, I had the great honor to give a tribute to Michael Maxwell. Now, Michael Maxwell was the dean of, he was the chair of history, but also the dean of arts now I want to get this right, from 1983 to 86, and then from 89 to 91. That is, he was the dean both before and after Richard Salisbury. And just by coincidence, he and Richard Salisbury were the two deans when I was an undergraduate here and a master's student here in the 1980s. So I feel as if there's all sorts of worlds that are aligning right now in terms of being able to introduce you to this lecture and give some remarks from the dean's office, but also to attend what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful guest lecture by Professor West. So I guess my responsibility here as an interim dean to welcome you, if you're students, faculty members, or guests from Montreal or from farther afield. The Salisbury lecture has been mentioned is in memory of Richard Salisbury, who was the chair of anthropology from 1966 to 1970, and dean of arts, as I mentioned, from 1986 to 89. He had a distinguished career that Professor Galati is going to talk about in a moment, including being elected as Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 1974. We're obviously deeply indebted to the Salisbury family for their contributions to McGill University and for establishing this lectureship, for bringing in wonderful distinguished guest lecturers from around the world. The purpose is to pay tribute to Professor Salisbury, but also bring distinguished scholars who have made a very significant impact to the discipline of anthropology. and to really sort of enrich the life of the Department of Anthropology, of the Faculty of Arts, of the general academic community at McGill by addressing, anthropological issues that are relevant to contemporary questions that we're discussing and debating right now. So that's all I'm going to say. I guess just personally, it's just wonderful to see everyone here in person to sort of reboot lecture series like this. It's actually quite heartwarming to have sort of in-person lectures again. And so without further ado, I'll just introduce Professor Galati, who will just speak briefly about Richard Salisbury's life and his contributions to anthropological research. So thank you again, Les. Thank you.
The term briefly has been used twice in the last couple of minutes, so I'll attend to that as I say a few words about Richard Salisbury. I realize now that I may be the only person in anthropology in the department who actually knew Dick Salisbury, even though it feels like yesterday that we were colleagues together in administration and of course in the department. I first met Dick Salisbury when I came here for an interview, and that was 1977. And I was, Marshall Solins, who was my committee member and mentor, said, well, Dick is a top-notch fellow, which is a sort of a pregnant with all kinds of meanings. And when I spoke to him, I was a little bit nervous because in my mind, which was probably overstating the case, he was representative of the formalists in the debates going on at that time in terms of economic anthropology. And I felt myself positioned with the substantivists, of whom Karl Polanyi and Marshall Solins were representative. So I was a little bit nervous coming into an interview, and of course, Dick was very genial, very non-confrontational, and at a certain point he said, well, the substantivists and the formalists, I think they're very complementary in the way they look at economic issues, and I felt so relieved. So suddenly the burden of confrontation that was not really mine was lifted off of me, and that was the first of many, many conversations that I had with Dick, which were always full of life and interesting, and him pulling in anecdotes from his past experiences. Coming from a heady environment at the University of Chicago that really privileged pure research and theory, I found the practical atmosphere that was instilled in our department by Dick Salisbury to be a little bit disquieting, as if our debates about culture theory, in fact, should actually matter in the real world. And this idea, which stemmed from Dick Salisbury's enormous influence in the department and of course in the discipline, has in fact guided me in my entire career. The idea that we're looking at things that have theoretical implications and therefore have the ability to travel in terms of their applicability, and on the other hand, mean something to the people who we've been living with. Dick was the founding chair, actually, of the Department of Anthropology, which was split from sociology in 1966, and then began its life as a department of its own. But he was also a founder of the development anthropology in general, in the field, in the discipline, linking our discipline to the lives and struggles of indigenous peoples. That was a central mission. And institutionally, he made a difference here because he founded the program in the anthropology of development. And for many decades, it occupied quarters in 3434 McTavish, which we're all familiar with. It's just across the street. And that building has, in fact, accommodated numerous projects inspired out of anthropology, and so we've been sort of sitting in the same place as the program in the anthropology of development for many decades. He was also director of the Center for Developing Area Studies, which doesn't exist anymore, but it transmuted into something called ESID. So the people who know ESID know that it has a history, and Dick Salisbury was one of the founders, and then for many years was the director of CTAS as we knew it then. He was president of a whole series of anthropological associations, including CASCA, which is still a place that we all travel to. That's the Canadian Anthropology Society, and the Society for Economic Anthropology, as well as others. Dick was an individual who was intrinsically fair and had a good sense, and he was an equitable person. So he always sort of calmed the waters around him, found solutions. He was a stabilizing figure in the faculty and the university and in the department. However, at the same time, battles between the Marxists and whatever the other side was raged around him. And he sort of had this calmness about all of these matters, even as though he was sometimes the target of accusations. He was bilingual, and he served as a consultant to the bodies that oversaw the James Bay projects that was involved in building an enormous dam on the lands of the Cree, and which were promised to disrupt their traditional land use practices. So he was an advisor to the major bodies that were going to make the dam and during the dam. He was also advisor to the Indians of Quebec Association, as it was known then, as the James Bay Treaty was negotiated and agreed to. At the same time, he initiated a multi-year project that looked at the aftermath of the James Bay agreements, and that also funded the work of a number of graduate students, including Harvey Fite, who some of you might know, and Colin Scott, whom everyone knows. His book, A Homeland for the Cree, still informs Crees in their ongoing negotiations with Quebec, because of course negotiations aren't something that is one-off. It's a relationship as opposed to a moment in time. Dick's balanced but empathic studies on subjects that matter to Indigenous peoples had begun with his research on economic change that he carried out in Papua New Guinea with the Siane people. That provided the research materials that carried him through his MA degrees at Harvard in 1955, Cambridge in 1956, and his PhD at Australian National University in 1957, one after another. His book, From Stone to Steel, Economic Consequences of a Technological Change in New Guinea, 1962, became a classic in economic anthropology. Once chatting with him at the American Anthropological Association meetings, he broke off to warmly greet Maurice Godelier, a French Marxist anthropologist whom perhaps many of you are aware of and know his work, and who I figure may be a theoretical antagonist of Richard Salisbury. Again, sort of jumping to conclusions. But no, they embraced one another very warmly and then chattered away in New Guinea Pidgin, showing that any sense of antagonism was really not there. Showing as well that Dick sort of transcended all of the differences and the different types of debates that he engaged in, because at the end of the day, the discipline is forged out of personal relationships between the people who pursue their research. And of course, he was close to all those who were working in New Guinea at that time. Richard Salisbury's leadership extended from the department to the university to the profession. The last stage of his life that we've just heard about, before being afflicted by cancer and passing away in 1989, he served as Dean of the Faculty of Arts. The Richard Salisbury Student Award is presented by the Canadian Anthropology Society at CASCA for dissertation fieldwork. The Salisbury Prize in Anthropology is awarded each year to the McGill student who presents the best research paper honors thesis. And the Richard Salisbury Memorial Lecture offers us an opportunity to reflect on the life of a remarkable human being who helped to found the institutions relevant to anthropology and development studies at McGill. He contributed to the shaping of the theoretical framework of our discipline, and importantly, asserted the importance of pursuing research that mattered to the lives of Indigenous communities. He was ahead of his time, for anthropology now takes as an ethical imperative what Dick Salisbury initiated as central to development anthropology here and in the discipline in general. The imperative is to use research to understand how development processes that are at work all the time could advance Indigenous interests as they themselves perceive them. So it's my great pleasure to present a few words about Dick Salisbury, a remarkable human being and one who we should remember as the founder of a discipline, but also of our department. He's our ancestor. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Those that was perfect. That was really perfect. So we're almost there, I promise. I get the honor of introducing Paige West. But before I do that, first I want to share a little story. I recently learned in a faculty meeting some interesting things about conflicts and interests that I feel like I should air before I move forward. A disclosure, if you will. I know Paige West. And I have been interested in her work since at least 2013. And in that interest, I sought her out as a PhD committee member. It was also in that interest that I proposed to my colleagues of the anthropology department that she be considered as a distinguished guest at our second biannual Richard F. Salisbury Memorial Lecture. So there. Today, I consider Paige a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. So when trying to think of how to introduce Paige West today, I thought it would be very easy. How unprepared I was, however, when I confronted the reality of her many accomplishments and awards. An all too familiar anxiety seized my chest as I managed to utter the thought, perhaps I don't know Paige West like I thought I did. On the other hand, the existential horror of bleak and utter aloneness of this moment seemed to, at the very least, make the conflicts and interests take on less transgressive arrangements in my worrying thoughts. So I thought I would just start with the basics. Paige West is the endowed Claire Toe Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University and Barnard College. She is also the current director of the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University. At the very beginning of her career in 2002, Dr. West received the American Anthropological Association's Anthropology and Environment Junior Scholar Award for her work, and the recognitions only continued to materialize from there. She was asked to deliver the Leonard Hastings Scoff Memorial Lectures at Columbia in 2013. In 2016, she was named Distinguished Scholar by the National Science Environmental Synthesis Center and an advisor to the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. Most recently, Dr. West was named a Guggenheim Fellow in 2020, for which she is now writing a book tentatively titled Anti-Prayer for the World, which I'm very excited to read. This will be her fourth book. Her other books have received several awards and distinguished honors. And this is on top of several co-edited volumes, special editions of journals, and far too many journal articles to mention. She's also the founder of the journal Environment and Society, Advances in Research. We could go on with this impressive list of achievements and acknowledgements of Dr. West's scholarship, but I think it is safe to say that it is not just my interest alone that justifies Dr. West's presence here with us tonight. I would also like to highlight another impressive quality of Dr. West's, namely the way she has always fought to locate her academic work alongside and in conversation with real-world issues. For instance, she was, maybe still is, the head grant writer and volunteer anthropologist for ALAN's Awareness. a small NGO focused on small-scale conservation projects created by Indigenous peoples and their national conservation scientist colleagues. She is the co-founder of the PNG Institute of Biological Research, a small NGO dedicated to building academic opportunities for research in Papua New Guinea by Papua New Guineans. She's also co-founder of the Roviana Solwara Skull, a school in Papua New Guinea dedicated to teaching at the nexus of Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific knowledge. It is Dr. West's commitment to people and their stories and the ways that stories come together and bounce off in all sorts of directions that makes Dr. West such a brilliant ethnographer in my estimation. And it makes her not only a sophisticated theorizer, but a responsible theorizer too. What I learned from Paige early on was not simply to learn theory at the seminar table, but to find it in the world and figure out how it was making things happen, and in turn, to learn how to make things happen with it. She taught me to ask questions and to see as an ethnographer, to attune myself to spaces and places, and to become aware of the ways by which abstractions shape the world, and that we ethnographers are also part of the worlds we seek to make claims about. I look upon ethnographies that Dr. West writes with admiration, particularly for the ways she foregrounds her own geopolitical and subjective position in the anthropology of development and conservation. One sees how she has navigated the competing interests that have tried to capture her as a translator or legibility-making service for conservation activists, practitioners, or alternatively how critical academic colleagues have wanted her to be the bearer of devastating critique of conservation as a way of knowing and producing knowledge. So Paige has always kind of found a way through this her own way, and she didn't choose sides. She made something else, and I think this is admirable, and it's how I want to be an ethnographer and anthropologist in the world. So there's an example, I think, that we can see this very clearly in the way that recently and provocatively Paige inverted Malinowski's early questions in order to push the field of economic anthropology beyond its original conditions of war and colonial relations between centers and peripheries. Instead of asking why people in Papua New Guinea would risk their lives to sail canoes across enormous and dangerous seas to trade necklaces and armbands, as Malinowski did, as I'm sure we all know, Dr. West asks why people of the global north continue to risk their lives and others by continuing to consume at obscene rates. I obviously, I didn't meet or know Richard Salisbury personally, but based on what I do know of his work, I think this inverted question would be entirely sensible to him. I think he would recognize it. And as I've learned from our own Colin Scott, in a tribute to Salisbury, Salisbury liked to ask a very similar kind of question of McGill. He said, how does my development affect people in the North? This question not only unified his commitments to organizational building and developments of the self, but grounded his commitment to the discipline of anthropology as in service of people, enhanced communication, and social equality. In these words, I recognize so many harmonies with the work of Paige West, the way she is committed to the world, to her students, to her interlocutors, whether they be from PNG, Papua New Guinea, or rich old American men touring the Trobriand Islands. This is why we invited Paige for this momentous occasion, because like Salisbury, she knows how to build things in the world, and she does so with a gentle and nurturing touch, which is not to say an uncritical one either. And I think we could use a mix of these skills and sensibilities, particularly as so many of us are working at McGill today to move forward enormous projects of divesting and reinvesting and pursuing projects of justice that are committed to not only bringing into the fold those who have been historically left out, but also creating space for those who have been left out to start asking and framing some of the questions and becoming the energetic force of material, symbolic, and spiritual transformation of this place. When thinking of equity, diversity, and inclusion committees, for instance, or how I would like to imagine the indigenization or decolonization of my discipline, department, and university, I am utterly indebted to Paige in the ways that I'm still learning about. Her voice is always singing in my head, quite literally. And so today, I wasn't sure I was going to do this, but I am, in a gesture of opening this event in a good way and also honoring Paige, I am going to sing a short song for you all. Lord help me. I first learned this song this year at Sundance. And it's a warrior song, particularly women warrior songs. And it makes me think of Paige, to be quite honest. And it's been in my head since August 17th. So I finally have the opportunity to sing it. So thank you for sitting through that lesson in Mushamis temporality. And I'm now finally willing to turn over the floor to our distinguished guest, Dr. Paige West.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. It's an honor to be delivering the Richard Salisbury Memorial Lecture and to be thinking with y'all about the possible futures for the field of anthropology. I want to thank the Salisbury family so much for making my visit possible, and I want to thank everyone else here who did so. I want to thank Les, but I will cry.
Okay, I'm a crier too.
So we will leave that thank you for later. The honor of being in community with you here today is not mine alone. Like most scholarship, my work is the result of a densely intertwined set of social relationships. Most importantly, the lecture I'm going to deliver today highlights work I've done in partnership with colleagues from New Ireland Province, Papua New Guinea. I'll tell you about some of these colleagues in what follows, but at the outset of our time together, I want to mark that none of my anthropological practice would be possible without a range of collaborators, interlocutors, friends, and critics from across Papua New Guinea. I do not know how to make these slides go forward. Oh, that's okay.
I don't know how to do it either, I guess.
Thank you. So this is a map of the part of the world where Papua New Guinea is. You can see the island of New Guinea, second largest island in the world. Papua New Guinea is the eastern half of it. And today we'll be talking about New Ireland Province, which you see is off the northern coast of the island. In the first slide and in the second slide, you get a better sense of New Ireland. West New Britain and East New Britain to the bottom, and the things that are marked are all part of New Ireland. Storms. We've been in the boat for hours. Jay, who is a young man now, is lying with his head in my lap and his father's jacket pulled tight over his eyes. He's 6 years old at the time. I can feel his little body shaking, and I don't know if he's cold or if he's crying, so I pull him tighter. It's July 2009, and we're making the trip from Lavangai Island, which some of you may know from the anthropological literature as New Hanover, to the big island of Latingai, which some of you may know from the anthropological literature as New Ireland Island. A trip that on a day of calm seas takes about 3 hours to travel 35 nautical miles. Our boat, called a banana boat locally, is a 15-foot long open skiff. There are 10 of us in the boat, mostly huddled down low so as to distribute our weight evenly, and holding on to each other so as to protect the children from the wind and the waves. I am terrified, less because of the conditions, although they're worrisome. Huge waves, black skies, high winds. And more because of Jay's father, John Iney, my research partner, a man who has spent his entire life on the sea, and someone who is always full of joy when he is on the water, is silent. On our trip to Lavangai a few weeks earlier, our boat had been lighter in every sense of that word. There were 4 of us then, all adults. John and I were heading out to Lavangai to have some conversations with the elders about social and ecological change, and to pick up Jay and his 3 siblings from John's natal village where they had spent the school holidays. On that trip out, our boat skidded over impossibly blue water between low-lying island groups that make up New Ireland Province, one of the 22 provincial-level divisions that comprise the sovereign state of Papua New Guinea. There is no word in my vocabulary to describe the blue of that ocean, or the feeling of looking down as you speed over a reef in what's one of 1 or 2 of the most biologically diverse spots on this extraordinary planet. On our trip out to Lavangai, we drank a lot of beer. M, who does not drink, was driving and laughing at our nonsense as he sped across the sea. All of us erupting into gales of laughter when Aaron Moaki, an elder, who is international superstar comedian level funny, and who also knows all that there is to know about the passages between the world of the living and the world of ancestors, animals, plants, and spirits. On that day, he commanded me to fetch him beer after beer after beer, and then he commanded me to give him my hat so he would not get sunburned, subtly mocking my absurdly white skin in the post-colonial wake of German, British, and Australian colonialism in his place, and then not so subtly mimicking my frequent application of sunscreen to hilarious effect. That day, talking about family, life, what's going on in the wider world, town gossip, village gossip, New York City gossip, and anything else that crosses our mind. It was a perfect, beautiful day at sea. The weather was fine when we started our trip back to New Ireland a week later. John and I were tired, having been up late at a far end of the village, talking with people, and then walking back at dawn to John's sister's house. Aramoki stayed on Lavangai, as did M, but the 4 children, John and I, the village's Catholic priest, John's aunt, and 2 of his nephews, all climbed into the boat for the return trip home. As soon as Lavangai village faded from our vision and we moved into open ocean, the weather started to turn. We were in unsheltered waters for about 20 nautical miles until we made it to more sheltered waters. And in those unsheltered waters, the boats crashed into 12-foot high waves, and the rain drove into us, soaking us all to the bone. We went slowly so the boat would not flip over and so the motor would not flood. And the trip took hours and hours to complete. We made it home safely, and in the end, aside from a few good stories to tell, like the moment when there was a break in the storm and we were sheltered in the Tigaks, and the priest, a man from the mainland of Papua New Guinea, looked down and saw a dugong, which is the Pacific cousin of the Atlantic manatee, and screamed with joyous wonder, "It's a mermaid! It's a mermaid!" None of us were the worse for wear physically. But that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, when John, his Aunt Jenny, and I were sitting around the hearth, John said that he had never seen a storm like that in July, and that he had never seen water that high or waves that big. Jenny, who's much older than us, said that the storm's pattern of movement was off, that it came from the wrong direction. And in my memory, although I was what my grandmother would have called bone tired, what I remember most is a look that passed between John and I when his aunt said, "This is not right." At the time, John and I had already been reading academic papers about climate change for years, and we'd been discussing the increasing evidence for climate change in New Ireland. We also both knew that people in the Cataract Islands were moving to the big island of Bougainville because our islands were no longer fully inhabitable the way they had been historically. But like everyone else, we were not ready for the relentless presence of that kind of change. And today, 13 years later, we both mark that trip as something that transformed us. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that John and I have been doing together since that trip. The socio-ecological context. New Ireland is a marine province that's comprised of several large islands like New Ireland and New Hanover and Lahire, as well as numerous small island groups. The region has a long colonial history that includes missionization, blackbirding, which for people who don't know is a conscription of native labor for plantation work in both colonized New Ireland and on sugarcane plantations in Australia, and forced relocations. Today, there are 243,000 residents who speak 23 unique languages with 45 dialects. And Indigenous people make up the vast majority of the residents of New Ireland, with only about 8% of the population born outside the province. 75% of the population lives adjacent to and relies upon the marine environment and coral reef system for their income, for the food they eat, for their recreation, for their ritual needs and obligations, and for a whole host of other relations that make life worth living. This pattern of habitation fits with the broader region of Oceania, as does the reliance on marine environments. Throughout the region, between 50 and 90% of people's dietary protein needs are met through marine species consumption. So Papua New Guinea is located in the extraordinarily biologically diverse ecoregion that international conservation organizations have termed the Coral Triangle. This includes Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste. Species richness for reef fish, corals, Bryopsidae microalgae, and multiple groups of gastropod and crustaceans are between 2 and 50 times higher in this region compared to other sites in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. A distribution pattern that when mapped appears like a bullseye right on top of the country. The marine environments surrounding Papua New Guinea are some of the healthiest and richest in this region. They're home to over 1,600 species of reef fish alone. Additionally, more than 430 species of coral and 954 species of mollusk have been documented in the southern provinces, while on the northern coast of the country, there's a well-documented hotspot for marine benthic invertebrates, where multiple taxa reach their global species richness maximums. Collaborators. When John Iney, who you see on the screen, that's John's favorite picture of himself. He says he looks like a model. When John and I first met, he'd been directing the NGO Islands Awareness since its inception. He, his brother Miller Iney, and their cousin Michael Laddie had co-founded Islands Awareness in 1993. After John had been working for the Papua New Guinea Department of Fisheries for a decade, conducting assessments of local fish stocks and facilitating community-based natural resource management awareness campaigns for national and international organizations. The three men believed that community-based natural resource management could be done more effectively if awareness campaigns were designed and run by the indigenous people from the areas where people were being asked to conserve things. From 1993 to 2007, they built the NGO and worked towards the creation of marine protected areas using models provided by external organizations. They were at the forefront of what was then called techniques for community engagement. Their most well-known practice was what they called the roadshow, trips to visit villages that had been targeted by external conservation organizations for conservation education, because these places were adjacent to vulnerable marine environments. In their conservation awareness work, John, Miller, and Michael used a combination of John's fisheries management training, Miller's theater training — Miller was a gifted actor and a playwright and a singer — and Michael's knowledge of local protocols and practices. And they used those skills to teach people a curriculum based on external conservation ecology. But by 2007, they had become frustrated with the mismatch between external conservation goals and the multifaceted nature of local needs. So my early anthropological work focused on, among other things, understanding how scientists come to know and describe Papua New Guinea in terms of place, biodiversity, and tradition, and what those descriptions and understandings do both in terms of environmental conservation in the country and in terms of fixing so-called nature and so-called culture in the minds of outsiders. Another aspect of it was an analysis of the social and material effects of conservation interventions in indigenous communities in the highlands of the country. But during that work, I was forced to turn a critical analytic lens onto my own fields of study, anthropology and political ecology, and ask myself some hard questions about those fields, given that I was asking hard questions of ecologists, biologists, and other conservation scientists. This was the mid-1990s and early 2000s, and my work was in conversation with the important new work in the anthropology of development that was a trenchant critique of development as an ideology, practice, and discourse that had to be contextualized in both the historical genealogies of colonialism and in deep analyses of political economies. As I was doing all of this work and writing about it, I was lucky enough to constantly be challenged by my colleagues from Papua New Guinea, most of whom are ecologists, biologists, and environmental activists. Initially, they saw me, a young white American woman with a faculty position at an elite university, as someone who was replicating the very histories of dispossession that I was theorizing and critiquing with my scholarship. And because of this, they pushed me then and they pushed me now. Initially, they asked me, what does your scholarship do for people in Papua New Guinea? And how are you going to change the unequal conditions that you illuminate with your research? Miriam Sapuma, in particular, who has the blue shirt on, who's an age mate of mine and a good friends, constantly pushed me to express to her why critique mattered and what else I was going to do. So because of these questions, in the early 2000s, I co-founded something called the Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research, which Les talked about a little bit, with scholars from PNG and two other American researchers. So PNG-IBR was a small NGO that focused on providing a pipeline for young scholars from Papua New Guinea to earn master's and doctoral degrees in the ecological and social sciences at international universities and then return home. In 2007, I was visiting New Ireland with colleagues from PNG-IBR, thinking through potential marine sites for students in our pipeline project. At the time, Islands Awareness, that NGO that John had co-founded, maintained a small office next door to the offices of a big international NGO in a building owned by the National Fisheries Authority. Each day, when the heat in the cinder block building became unbearable, after a morning full of emails, staff meetings, and report writing, the entire Islands Awareness staff would move their office chairs outside and sit under the building's awning. Here they would drink coffee, chew betel nuts, smoke cigarettes, and talk with people as they arrived at the wharf to drop off their catch at the small adjacent fish factory, to refuel their boats, to visit the National Fishery Authority offices, or to wait for relatives to collect them from the dock. My first introduction to Islands Awareness and to John was when a British conservation ecologist complained about them to me. The ecologist found the practice of sitting outside to be an example of what they termed as laziness, and articulated that this was what showed that we needed something called capacity building in conservation NGOs in Papua New Guinea. What went unnoticed by this ecologist was what looked to them like dereliction of duty and leisure was actually the Islands Awareness staff talking with islanders about fish catch, conditions at sea, reef health, community health and needs, and a range of other topics that are crucial for marine conservation. The conservation ecologists did not recognize that these conversations were a key part of local methodology and a key part of local epistemic practice. And they did not see that the parking lot was a crucial site of what we both might call in anthropology qualitative research and quantitative research. The NGO staff were conducting interviews. They were doing participant observation, and they were counting things. They were counting fish and kinds of fish. They were counting boats and kinds of engines. They were keeping track of who owns boats and who does not own boats. And they were keeping track of what island groups were bringing what kinds of catch for what kinds of market at every moment. So John and I met for the first time that afternoon, and that day we began a conversation about conservation practice in the country and the role that international NGOs were playing in it. A wonderful man from New Zealand who had funded some of John's NGO work introduced us. He and John had been having conversations where John was beginning to express his increasing frustration and discomfort with Euro-American conservation. And those conversations had reminded the man from New Zealand of some of the things that I had written about in my first book. So based on our initial conversation and several more that took place in the summer of 2007, John and I produced a draft of a plan for what conservation might look like. It was kind of a fantasy plan of what conservation might look like when driven by community interest and needs, indigenous knowledge-making practices, co-produced research on the health of marine biodiversity and reef ecosystems, and what was then a really growing field of decolonial research methods and practices, and with a real attention to anthropology. So since then, we've worked together with people from numerous communities and an increasing network of elders from across the region to try and bring this shared vision, this fantasy, into reality through the creation of what we call VALA areas. And VALA areas are an alternative to externally designed and imposed marine protected areas. Sorry. So a moment about marine protected areas. There's a lot to say about MPAs. They've been used globally to varying degrees of success. In some places, they increase fish biomass in both the long and the short term. They curtail illegal fishing by international fishing fleets, and they provide refuge for critically endangered marine species. In other places, they serve as a constant reminder to indigenous and other coastal peoples that they do not have sovereignty over the systems that they have sustained historically and that have sustained them historically. Many MPAs have externally designed governance structures that do not fit with local and indigenous governance structures, And at some sites, external conservation interests prioritize minimizing human use of marine plants and animals, while local fishers prioritize usage that they have had historically. This causes conflict in many instances. In the past decade or so, some wonderful and forward-thinking conservation scientists have begun to see the importance of indigenous and local uses of marine resources for local health and well-being, and they've begun to incorporate what they call livelihoods into MPA structures. They've also, frankly, realized that marine protected areas absolutely do not work if you don't have indigenous people and local people as your partners. But many externally demarcated marine protected areas, even when they recognize the importance of local socio-ecological assemblages, are facilitated with a focus on the social use of reefs and species that assumes purely instrumental relations between people, plants, animals, and entire ecological systems. While the acknowledgement by some scientists that people living in places like Papua New Guinea depend on the reefs for subsistence and livelihoods is crucial for any conservation success, people in New Ireland have deeper relations with their biophysical surroundings and the other beings that inhabit them than can be captured by the facts of so-called subsistence and so-called livelihood. While many outsiders who come to New Ireland assume that these deeper relations have been eroded by missionization, colonization, and capitalism, Patrick Kaiku and other Papua New Guinean researchers, as well as anthropologists like Paula Rubel and Abe Roseman, showed that since the first incursion to what is now New Ireland in the early 17th century, New Irelanders have been consistently maintaining socio-spiritual relations with their surroundings and their ancestors. In New Ireland, attempts to foster long-term marine system health must recognize the socio-spiritual connections between people and their reefs. So the Islands Awareness Approach. After our initial meeting in 2007, John and I wrote a collaborative grant proposal after we kind of fantasized about what conservation should look like. We thought, well, we should get some money if we're really going to do this. So we wrote a collaborative grant proposal to fund a pretty simple idea. We wanted to spend a couple of years talking to people about social and ecological changes that they identified as important and concerning. We wanted to understand what they understood to be the drivers for these changes, and if so, how, they wanted to mitigate the changes that they identified. Eventually, we received funding from the Christensen Foundation that allowed us to conduct a large multi-language ethnographic project across New Ireland province. We were doing some of this work in the boat trip that I described at the beginning of the talk. So we had both seen external actors come to Papua New Guinea with extant ideas about declining biodiversity and models for understanding what actions and events were causing that decline and what methods might reverse it. All of these models were derived from work elsewhere, and when put to work in Papua New Guinea, they got things wrong, they missed nuance, they imported erroneous assumptions, they created projects that failed spectacularly and not so spectacularly, and they dispossessed local people in myriad ways. They also made serious assumptions about what kinds of changes should and shouldn't matter to local people. So we wanted our work together to start from a point of listening. And we set out to talk to as many people as we could and to really develop our collective listening practices. Listening to each other, listening to people in the region, listening to elders, listening to our critics. And we used a multi-method approach, drawing from anthropology and from local and indigenous research techniques to collect our data. We then sat down with people from New Ireland, analyzed these data, and concluded that there are a whole host of systems that people want to see flourish. These systems are ecological, they're social, they're spiritual, they're economic, and they're political. They're often the combination of some or all of these things. Some of these systems are ancient and some are not. And people in New Ireland always have robust theories of causality, having asked themselves and others why things are changing and why things are not flourishing quite a bit. A key piece of this analytic process was, and continues to be, working with elders to understand deeply nested forms of causality. In this process, we've drawn a lot from the work of anthropologist Andrew Pete Vida. and what he's written about progressive contextualization. Pete, who was a friend and frankly an intellectual sparring partner who infuriated me and pushed me intellectually for 25 years, died earlier this year. And I regret that I never told him how much putting his work in conversation with my Cornelius Gassett, who you see a quote from him. Cornelius is in the picture with the brown shirt on. I am ashamed that I never told Pete what it felt like to put his work in conversation with my Gassett's thinking. Part of our process has been to pull together external analytics and methodologies and local analytics and methodologies for understanding. This might mean me translating a summary of, can I see her, Lisa Stevenson's work, to our elders, and then rubbing this up against what they know. And this is actually something that we've done when we've thought about kind of collectively there about ethnographic indeterminacy, what to tell and what not to tell, and how to narrate or how not to narrate the spirit world. We kind of all thought with you, so thank you for that. But that process of taking anthropology and rubbing it up against what elders already know about the world has been a pleasure. It might also mean reading a hot anthropological text together, John and I, and then riffing off of it when we're sitting around with Michael Laddie and the other Islands Awareness staff. And it might mean me creating a PowerPoint focused on an increasingly prevalent analytic within anthropology and talking with communities about what they think about its analytic promise. So since analyzing the data from the initial work and through this ongoing process of data analysis, John and I have worked together with people from villages around the province and our elder advisors. We've created local sites that help to both conserve and make flourish the socio-ecological and socio-spiritual environments that are an alternative to MPA that I'll turn to in a minute. We've also created programs to strengthen the local Maligan system. So Maligan's the name for a complex system of ceremonies, rituals, and customary practices in northern New Ireland that threads through life from before conception, through conception, to life, to death, to the afterlife. We've worked with people to create a cross-generational education center that I'll tell you about, and we've begun to work with women to think about women's roles in the socio-spiritual environment that they live. But I'm gonna spend some time now talking about VALA because I think VALA helps show this broader methodology in action. In Tungak, the indigenous language spoken by the founders of Islands Awareness, Vala describes a form of socio-spiritual ecological practice whereby people with deep ritual knowledge and expertise call on that knowledge, their relationship with their ancestors, their ecological knowledge, and their relations with certain marine species to create favorable conditions on a reef. These favorable conditions are both material insofar as they increase numbers of desirable and useful species, and social insofar as they smooth relations between living persons, spirits, and ancestors. This smoothing of relations maintains the health of people and the environments by acknowledging the ongoing social relationships between the living, the dead, and the otherwise. The practice of Vala is both a socio-spiritual practice and a material practice of placing a marker onto a reef to indicate to others that the area has been ritually enhanced and protected. Because of the socio-spiritual work of Vala, anyone who fails to adhere to the restrictions or prohibitions that have been placed on the reef by the ritual expert is in danger of falling ill or something else terrible happening to them. Areas and places become Vala through this combination of practice, demarcation, and local understanding that an area has been worked on by a ritual expert. While Vala is a Tungak term, the process described transcends different language groups in New Ireland province, and it's widely understood. So with Islands Awareness, what we call Vala plans are created, are custom made by a collaboration between the community and between outside researchers. Each one is uniquely designed to address the problem identified by the community and to use community-approved solutions. These plans draw on a combination of the Vala practices I just described and research conducted by John and I, Islands Awareness staff, and outside researchers. We use a comprehensive multi-stage process to ensure VALA plans and areas will effectively enliven the marine system, the people who use it, and the cultural traditions that have allowed this dynamic between the two to flourish. All right, I have a data-dense slide that, can you read that or no? No, absolutely not. Excellent. Okay, so I have a great slide, and we have a paper coming out in ORAX that actually shows this. That's our methodology, and I had about 20 pages in my talk that was about our methodology. Great 20 pages, but not going to be enough time to read those 20 pages. I'll just say this about our methodology. So one of the great things about the way that we work is that we never go to communities. Communities come to us. So John had a radio show for a long time. He is someone who is well known across the province. He has a family member who was an MP, and he's done a lot of work to kind of do education about the environment and other kinds of environmental work on the radio. We've also, so people know about him through that. Also, remember I talked about the process of research that Islands Awareness did early on, sitting in the parking lot at the fisheries wharf. People knew him from that. We've also really done a lot of work on social media, which is widely consumed there. So communities come to us. And we have a process whereby when a community comes, we talk with them and we think with them about what they've identified as a problem. And then we do a series of consultative meetings where Islands Awareness staff go to them, have conversations about what research is, what research looks like, what it means to invite someone into your community. We go away, the community comes back, says, yes, we'd like to understand this problem, we'd like to understand what's going on. People come with all kinds of things that they see as socio-ecological change that they're concerned about. People might come when they see a decline in fish species on the reef. They might come when they see a decline in young people wanting to learn to do certain things in the forest. They come, and once they've decided that they do want us to do some research to figure out what external drivers might be causing these changes, we go and do the research, we present the research to the community, and then the community works with Islands Awareness staff to come up with a plan for mitigating the change. Sometimes these plans are these VALA areas that I've talked about, sometimes the plans are other kinds of plans. But it's a great slide, I'm sorry that you're missing out on it. The ORAX paper is something we're proud of. It's called Reimagining Conservation Practice, Indigenous Self-Determination and Collaboration in Papua New Guinea. It's a long string of authors, including a number of our elders. It's the first time that they're going to be published. And ask me a question about that process. I have some very good stories about working with ORAX and helping them understand some things. Okay, so I'm going to give you two examples of VALA work. In one site, people saw a bay in which people saw the bay in which they fished for both local use and commercial species becoming less healthy, and they were concerned about this. Key species were declining, and there were a number of local theories of change. Working with colleagues from this site, interns from the National Fisheries College of Papua New Guinea, engineers from the local government, and local ecologists, we did a socio-ecological survey to understand what was happening. What we found was that a logging road built in the late 1980s had eroded, and that the physical changes from this erosion were changing the nutrient balance in the bay, and that people were coming from adjacent areas and fishing in the bay without permission from local elders. We also found that a huge number of young people had left the site to work in town, and that there was an undercurrent of worry among older folks that they were not able to train the young to carry out important social and ritual practices that would work to enliven and keep healthy the local reef system. So we worked with people to facilitate a plan of action that included repairing the structural problems with the road, instantiating a VALA area in the bay with strict protocols and rules, and creating a program that is helping to get young people excited about learning what older people want to teach them. And we also, through the Islands Awareness staff, helped to facilitate some conversations between older folks and younger folks that were uncomfortable conversations. I was not a part of those conversations, nor was John, but the staff were helping people to communicate and think about the reef together. In another site, we worked with elders who were having trouble controlling the taking of appropriately sized fish species from their local fringing reef area and keeping people from other islands off the reef. They set up a vala area. It was the first one we did, actually. And then, working with us, they revitalized a local fish trap. This was something that had not been done in New Ireland for decades. They drew on their own existing knowledge. They drew on interviews that they did with older people from their own community and from other communities. And they also drew on archival research that I and my students in Barnard and Columbia did. We also pulled together an annotated bibliography focused on text about fish traps in other places across Oceania. And we pulled in Professor Dorothy Billings. Dottie, who also just passed away, was an anthropologist who first went to New Ireland for field research in the late 1950s. She worked on both New Ireland Island and on Lavengai, or New Hanover Island, and was thrilled to talk with us. Dottie had known John, Michael, and Miller, founders of Islands Awareness, since they were born. She knew their mom. She knew John's mom and dad. And she was incredibly excited to provide with us all of the data that she had collected that she never had published anywhere. And all of that data touched on questions of fish traps. And so we were able, working with that data set, working with folks in Lavengai, to come up with a vala area that revitalized these fish traps, but did it in a way that people thought was contemporary, that continue to think is contemporary. So other kinds of collaborative work has grown out of this vala work, and I'll speak briefly about it. In 2012, a group of elders and master carvers came to John and I and noted that we had been doing a lot of work on conservation of natural resources, or what is termed conservation of natural resources. And they asked us to think with them about the longevity and liveliness of the Mulligan system. So Mulligan includes what I talked about earlier, but it also includes the carving of extraordinary wooden objects. And since then, we've worked with folks to think about how we might get Mulligan carving techniques and the entire socio-ecological and spiritual matrix they're a part of moving into the future. Here we partnered with the American Museum of Natural History and the U.S. Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation and created a digital archive of Mulligan objects housed at international museums that's been repatriated to the master carvers and their families through a gift of iPads from the Tao Foundation. And here you will see that. You'll see John and I talking with a carver about how to use an iPad. And then this is the carver sitting with his family and his wife. This is an amazing moment in this photograph because the woman with the gray hair is the carver's wife, and she's pointing out objects that her father carved that are in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And so it's a pretty cool moment, but it's also a moment that you see all the kids around there. The kids got incredibly excited about that. And so using this mix of kind of revitalization, technology, and then just stepping back, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, stepping back. The carvers have used the iPads as an impetus to create lineage-specific carving schools that are getting lots of young people interested in the more esoteric aspects of Mulligan in addition to learning to carve. We also co-founded the Saltwater School, and this is a school that's dedicated to teaching at the nexus of indigenous and scientific knowledge. So the school basically functions like a sleepaway camp for kids, and what we do when we have the funding for it is we bring kids together with a group of elders who have very specific knowledge about a certain species or a certain process, and scientists who work on that same question. And there they have conversations across those different epistemic practices, and the students get to be a part of it. They also do wonderful field projects where the students are learning with people in the field. Out of this has grown a project where we're working with the local Maimais, and I'll say more about Maimais in a minute, to revitalize traditional leadership structures. If you think you recognize him, that is in fact John in that picture. He also likes that picture of himself. And then finally, in late 2009, we received a grant that was going to allow us to expand our Maligan work even farther. Women leaders came to us in 2007 and asked us to work with them on documenting and revitalizing women's dances, songs, and epistemic practices around biodiversity as they were connected to Maligan. This work was stalled by COVID-19, but I want to give a shout out to our wonderful funder, Synchronicity Earth, who basically allowed us on a dime to change the funding plan and to use all of the money that they had given us for COVID-19 education. We were able to work with a local nursing college and a local hospital to take healthcare workers to remote islands to talk to people about COVID prevention and to try to dispel some of the misinformation around the pandemic that was flowing to them through social media. Just this month, we received another grant from this amazing organization, again, Synchronicity Earth, they're incredible, that's allowing us to create a new pipeline project. This pipeline program will create conditions where young women from New Ireland who are enrolled in the University of Papua New Guinea can work with us to develop their honors thesis projects and use those projects to apply for MA and PhD positions in anthropology and conservation ecology. So back to our methodology. Our methodology relies on a set of ethical guidelines that we've developed with the people that we work with, people that we think of as our advisors. And it's based on a three action-based principles and practices. Step up, mobilize resources, and step back. So stepping up. We go where we're asked. We do not impose ourselves on anyone. And we enter into a relationship. When we enter into a relationship with a community, it's for the long haul. We understand that social obligations do not end. We understand that there is nothing that is a simple exchange. These communities become family in both beautiful and complicated ways. And you do for your family. And this work falls primarily on John's shoulders because John is there year round and I'm only there during the North American summer. Mobilizing resources. Once we have a relationship with the community and we understand what their needs and desires are with regard to socio-ecological and socio-spiritual revitalization, we work to find the resources and tools that allow us to support what the community needs. We use the expertise we have in-house. We call on and draw on the expertise of our colleagues around the world. We work with interns from the University of Papua New Guinea, from the Fisheries College, from Barnard College, from Columbia University, from anywhere that wants to work with us. And we seek funding from foundations to conduct research and bring community plans into being. And this piece of our work falls squarely on my shoulders. I'm the grant writer, the report writer, the phone caller, the emailer, the up in the middle of the night doing Zoom calls with people all over the world to try and get them to give us money, and the node that facilitates the financial matrix that allows us to do this work. Stepping back. John and I believe that once we provided expertise and resources, communities must maintain sovereignty over their own projects. We've watched way too many NGOs micromanage community-based projects in a way that indicates to people that the project does not belong to them, that it belongs to outsiders. And while Islands Awareness absolutely provides ongoing consultation with communities, redoing plans, talking through things with people, talking about events on the ground, at a fundamental level, we believe that these projects belong to our partners and not to us, and so we do step back. We believe that entrusting these plans to the elders from the communities is both a way to ensure plan longevity and to strengthen respect for local elders. So this work falls on the shoulders of the elders who advise us and who choose to work with us. Conclusion, a little anthropology at the end. Back to the small boat in the big storm in 2009. I said that I think that trip changed me and changed John. I believe that the time we spent on that boat, in that storm, with those people, was well and truly a space of liminality. Initially a concept used to think through what early anthropologists called rituals or rites of passage. what I find useful about Victor Turner's intellectual engagement with Arnold van Gennep's work is his insight that there are moments that are in between periods during which there is a dramatic connection between thought, experience, and who we are as people, who we are as selves. Turner argues that in these moments of disorientation, our selves can dissolve in ways that generate new perspectives, and that at these times, societal structures momentarily cease to matter. Yet for Turner, once the moments of liminality are over, people in communities return to prior states of being as selves and prior states of being as part of a fixed social. So in 2009, John had just started his initiation process to become a Maimai. And Maimai are the most respected socio-ritual leaders in the region. Undertaking that multi-step and multi-year process is an extraordinary commitment whereby you agree to put yourself aside and to be willing to dedicate your entire life to your people. You agree to be on call constantly. You agree to adjudicate conflicts in ways that potentially might have horrific consequences for you and your family, for your health and safety. He had been asked to make a choice that summer between what he had been doing and what lay ahead as a ritual leader. And he was at the point where he could have turned back, but he didn't. I think that liminal space of the boat was one that, for John, pushed him to merge his life's work up until that point, environmental sustainability, stewardship, and love for the ocean, and the oncoming onslaught of initiation and the cultural responsibilities of being a Maimai. That space of liminality allowed him to see a path forward where spirit, ritual, research, partnership with an outsider, and his love for the sea could be merged. And since then, he has walked that path. He's charted a new way to be a Maimai, and it's magnificent. For me, July 2009 was the month that I received tenure at my university. Since I'd started my job in 2001, I had been hiding anything I did in Papua New Guinea that would track as applied to my senior colleagues and to the discipline more broadly. I'd also really, since starting graduate school, sublimated myself and become an empty container for with the sort of hope that the elite people who held my career and really my life in their hands would not see me, and that they would only see a reflection of themselves when they looked at me. And I was good at this. My outlet as a first-generation college student who was double majoring and working pretty much full-time when I was in college had been the campus theater and taking acting classes, and I am an excellent actor. But in that boat, in that space of liminality, I think that I, like John, saw a way forward that would allow me to stay in my place of employment, something that at that point I did not have to do. I had another job offer at the time. And to openly and proudly begin to tell my colleagues and others, you know, I do the work that I do. If you don't like it, I don't really care. And to begin to push our field in uncomfortable ways. And finally, to work in a way in this world that hopefully supports people's self-determination in ways that helps to allow them to live in the world in the way that they envision it, and to think of a future that is a future that they imagine as good. Because that is all we can do. Thank you.